Mute. All right. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Everybody, welcome to session number 22 of our slow reading of the Bezels of Wisdom, Fusus al-Hikam. Hope you all had a great week. It's been a very weird weather here. We've got, in one day, we got like 3 different seasons happening all at the same time. Otherwise, everything has been good. Let's see if other people are joining. Yes, no. Is there anybody in waiting room participants? Okay, it's all right. Here we are. We got a big read ahead of us here because I basically decided I was going to do this in a single session rather than 2 sessions. One of the reasons I decided to do this in one session is because the issues that are basically delineated in it are not that compact as compared to some of the other chapters that we've been reading. And also, this way we can get through to the book, and by my calculation, our last session after this one, after we finish this session, will end on December 14th, which will be the final part of the chapter of Muhammad. So this way we're getting through to the book. So anyway, without any further ado, the wisdom of compassion in the word of Solomon. And if I stop and start, it's because there's a little glitch with the speaker here that it automatically turns off and then shuts the mic, and then I have to actually manually turn it back on again. And so if I pause and I do that, please forgive me. Anyway, let's get cracking. The wisdom of compassion in the word of Solomon. It, meaning the letter, is from Solomon, and it, that is, the contents of the letter, are in the name of God, the compassionate, the merciful. Some have supposed that the name of Solomon is here given precedence over the name of God, but this is not so. They speak of it in a way that is not consonant with Solomon's gnosis of his Lord. Indeed, how could what they say be appropriate in view of what Belgis says, or Sheba, of it? I have been sent a respectful letter, that is, respectful to her. Perhaps they are prompted to say such things because of Khosru or Anushiravan, the Sassanid emperor, tore up the letter of the apostle of God, although he did not do so until he had read the letter and acquainted himself with its contents. Indeed, Belgis would have done the same had she not been fitted for grace as she was, nor would the placing of his name before or after the name of God have saved the letter from destruction. I don't understand the reasoning here that Ibn Arabi is putting in, explaining this very central element of the Surah Al-Nam, the Surah of the Ants. Solomon then mentions 2 kinds of mercy: the mercy of unobligating giving, or imtinan, and the mercy of binding obligation, or the wujub, which are the compassionate and the merciful. As the compassionate, he gives freely, while as the merciful, he binds by obligation, although the latter proceeds from the former, the merciful being implicit within the compassionate. God has prescribed, hold on a minute, let me allow these people in, admit. As the compassionate, he gives freely, while as the merciful, he binds by obligation, although the latter proceeds from the former, the merciful being implicit within the compassionate. God has prescribed mercy on himself for his servant in return for the acts performed by the servant, which are mentioned by God as a right God has imposed on himself, so that by those acts the servant might be deserving of his mercy, that is the mercy of obligation. Servants of this kind know well what part of themselves is the doer of the actions since human action is divided among 8 members. Now, God has shown that he is in reality the identity of each of the members, so that he is the only true agent, the form alone belonging to the servant. This identity is implicit in him, the servant, that is, in his name of servant alone, since God is the essence of what is manifest and what is called creature, by which the names, the outer and the last, may accrue to the servant, seeing that he was not and then existed. Similarly, the names, the inner and the first, al-batin, al-awwal, are his, because his being manifest and his acting are dependent on him. Thus, when you see a creature, you're seeing the first, al-awwal, and the last, al-akhir, the outer and the inner, al-zahir wal-batin. Solomon was by no means unaware of this knowledge, which was indeed an integral part of that dominion, mulk, according to no one after him, at least in his sensory manifestation. Muhammad was granted what was granted to Solomon, but it was not outwardly manifest. God gave Muhammad power over a demon that came to him by night to destroy him. He seized it and tied it to a pillar of the mosque until morning, when the children of Medina played with it. He had remembered the supplication of Solomon, and God had cast it out, but whereas Solomon exercised the power outwardly, Muhammad did not, meaning the power, the goetic power of controlling these malevolent beings. Solomon spoke of a dominion and not dominion as such, and we know that he wished for some dominion. We also know that others shared with him in every aspect of the dominion God granted to him, as we know that he was especially privileged and that he enjoyed that dominion in its totality, and as shown by the tradition concerning the demon, that he alone exercised it outwardly. Had Muhammad not said of the demon, God caused me to get the better of it, we would have said that when we went to seize it, God caused him to remember the prayer of Solomon, so that he might know that God was not giving him the power to seize it, since it was God who cast it away. When he said that God had caused him to get the better of it, we conclude that having granted him a certain freedom of action with it, God reminded him and he remembered the prayer of Solomon, acquitting himself in a similar manner. From this, we may learn that what was denied to creatures after Solomon was the manifestation of the dominion in a universal way. Our only aim in discussing this point is to expound on the 2 levels of mercy that Solomon mentioned in the 2 words, which in Arabic are Ar-Rahman wa Rahim. God binds or restricts the mercy of obligation and unleashes the mercy of giving in his saying, "My mercy encompasses everything," even the divine names, which are the real relationships. Indeed, he bestows on them by us, since we are the result of the mercy of giving on the divine names and dominical relationships. Then he made it binding on himself for us by our manifestation, and made us know that he is our identity, from which we might know that in truth he imposed it on himself only for himself, since the mercy is never outside of him. On whom, therefore, does he bestow, seeing that there is only he? Despite the oneness of the original essence, we must, when speaking of the various capacities of creatures in the sciences, express things in various details, so that no one says that such a one is more learned than another. This means that the scope of the divine volition, he has, Austin translates this as wish, the scope of the divine volition or irada falls short of the scope of the divine knowledge, which shows the comparative nature of the divine attributes. And this is a very imami thing to say, because this very point actually appears in one of the hadith of Khulaini, attributed to Imam Jafar as-Sadiq, that the knowledge of God precedes all of these other creative attributive imprints, including the will and the volition. This means that the scope of the divine volition falls short of the scope of the divine knowledge, which shows the comparative nature of the divine attributes, as with the superiority of the scope of his volition over his power. Or actually should be determination rather than power, because this is talking about qadar rather than qudra. Similarly, with his hearing and sight. Thus, all the divine names are graded according to their relative merits one with another, as is also the case with what is manifest in creation, so that one may say that such a one is more learned than another, despite the oneness of the essence. Just as, in emphasizing a particular name, one names it and describes it by all the names. Such is also the case of a particular creature, in that it may be qualified by all the qualities with which it is normally compared. This is because every part of the cosmos is the totality of the cosmos, in that it is receptive to the realities of the disparate aspects of the cosmos. Thus, the fact that the identity of God is the essence of Zayd and Amr does not contradict our saying that Zayd is less learned than Amr, since the identity is more perfect and knowing in Amr than in Zayd, the divine names being nothing other than the reality, however much they may vary in merit. Thus, God, as the knower, is more universal in his scope than as he who wishes or volites, or as the powerful or the determining, albeit he is in himself and none other. So, O friend, do not know him in one context and be ignorant of him in another, nor affirm him in one situation and deny him in another, unless you affirm him in an aspect in which he affirms himself and deny him in an aspect in which he denies himself, as in the verse in which the denial and affirmation of himself are brought together. He says, there's nothing like unto him, laisa kamithlihi shay'un, which is denial, and he is the hear, the seer, Samir Basir, which is an affirmation of himself with attributes attributable to all the living creatures that hear and see. There's always some living creature in the world hidden from the awareness of some men, which will be manifest in the hereafter to all men, it being the abode of the living, as is also this lower world, although its life is hidden from certain servants, so that the distinction and variety of degrees among God's servants concerning what they grasp of the reality of the cosmos may be demonstrated. He is here implicitly is kind of referring to the jinn and the subtle creatures, etc. The reality is more evident in one whose awareness is universal than in one who lacks such universality. So do not be deceived by the manifest disparity of created things into gainsaying the one who asserts that creation is nothing other than the identity of the reality. I have just demonstrated the disparity among the names of God, which you do not doubt are the reality, their significance being in the one named by them, which is none other than God Most High. How then may Solomon give precedence to his name over the name of God, as they say he did, seeing that he is but a part of the whole created by the divine mercy? Surely the compassionate, the merciful should have been put first to confirm the dependence of the one who receives the mercy. Indeed, the putting first of one who should be last and the putting last of one who should be first in the position he merits runs counter to all accepted realities. In her wisdom and sublime knowledge, Belgis, Sheba, does not mention the person who sent her the letter, so that her advisors might know that she was in touch with things the course of which they did not perceive. This is the way God, in the matter of dominion, since if the means of information coming to a ruler remain unknown to others, the people of the kingdom are very cautious in exercising their free will, and do not do so except in matters that have first been considered for them by their ruler, thus being safe from the possible evil consequences of such free action. Were it to be accorded to them by the one by whom the ruler is informed, they would treat with him and and honor him until they could do what they wanted, and the ruler would not hear of it. She said, a letter has been sent to me, without naming the sender as a matter of policy. She had inherited the awe of her people and close advisors, and so merited precedence over them. As for the superiority of human over demonic learning concerning the mysteries of disposition and the spatial nature of things, it may be known from the measure of time, since the perception of the eye is quicker than the action of one rising from his seat, the movement of the eye in perceiving its object being more rapid than the body in moving from its place. That is because the time it takes for perception to take place is the same as it takes to reach its object, no matter what the distance is between the perceiver and perceived. Since it takes no more time for an eye to open than for its sight to reach the fixed stars, just as the closing of the eye takes no longer than the ceasing of perception. The rising of a person is not the same and is not as rapid. Thus, Asif bin Barachia proved better in this respect than the jinn, since his utterance and his action took place in a single moment. In that moment, Solomon saw with his eye the throne of Belgis. Just a minute. Okay. In that moment, Solomon saw with his eye the throne of Belgis, Sheba, firmly set before him, lest he should imagine that he was seeing it while it remained in its own place without being moved. We do not know of instantaneous transference. Indeed, the causing not to be and to be of the throne happened in a way unknown to any but he who is apprised of it. In his saying, nay, they are in confusion regarding a new creation, although there was no lapse in time in which they did not see what they were looking at. If it is as we have said, then the moment of its disappearance from its place is the same as its presence with Solomon, by virtue of the renewal of creation by breaths. No one has any knowledge of this decree. Indeed, no one is aware of the fact in himself that with each breath he is not, and yet comes into being again. Therefore, do not say then, which implies a lapse of time, for the word thumma, then, in Arabic implies a process of cause and effect in specific situation, as the poet says, like the quivering of the spear, then it shook. Now, the time of its quivering is the same as that of its shaking. He says then, although there's no lapse of time. Similarly, with the renewal of creation by breaths, the moment of the non-existence of a thing is the very moment of the existence of its like, as with the renewal of accidents according to the Asherites. Now, this argument in itself is an extremely important argument, in my opinion, even in the rebuttal of something like reincarnation, right? Because Ibn Arabi is very precisely putting his finger on the fact that similarity does not tantamount to identity, even though somebody may have or claim to have memories of all kinds of past lives, but by the very creation and recreation of things at each moment, this argument can then be extended in the postmortem state itself, such that what is returning is not an incarnated similitude or a reincarnated instance of what has been. Right? So right there, this is like almost an unequivocal rebuttal of such arguments. The matter of the obtaining of the throne of Belgis Sheba is no different from most other theological questions, except for those who have inner knowledge of what we have just said about it. Asaf's only merit in the matter was that he effected the renewal in the court of Solomon. One who truly understands what we have said will realize that the throne covered no distance, that no land was folded up for it, nor was it penetrated. It happened by means of a follower of Solomon, so that it should be something greater for Solomon in the hearts of those present than for Belgis and her associates. That was because Solomon was a gift from God to David, and he says, and we gave to David Solomon. A gift is the bestowal of something as a favor by the giver, not a token of agreement or reward. Such a divine gift is the complete favor, the irrefutable argument, and the unmistakable stamp. Concerning his knowledge, he says, And we cause Solomon to understand it despite the contrary judgment of David, although God granted them both judgment and knowledge. David's knowledge was an acquired knowledge granted him indirectly by God, while Solomon's knowledge was God's own knowledge on the matter, he being the judge in the matter without intermediary, since Solomon was himself the exposition of God of perfect veracity. Likewise, one who strives and makes a right decision in a matter in which God has ruled, whether it be by his own effort or according to what God has inspired his apostle, has two rewards, while the one who makes a mistaken decision has only one, the former having used learning and judgment. Now, this community of Muhammad has been granted the rank of both Solomon and David in the matter of judgment. How fine a community it is. When Belgis, Sheba, saw her throne, knowing the great distance involved in the possibility in her view of it being moved in such a short time, she says, "It is as if it were it," so confirming that what we have said concerning the renewal of creation by similars. It is it, and so it confirms the divine command, since you are, in the moment of recreation, essentially the same as you were before it. Solomon's direction concerning the palace was characteristic of the perfection of his knowledge. She was told, "Enter the palace," which was paved in perfectly smooth glass. When she saw it, she thought it was a deep lake, so she bared her legs, so that the water should not reach her gown. He then explained to her that the seeing of her throne was after the same manner, which did more than justice to the matter. But that he showed her how right she had been in saying, "It is as if it were it." Then she said, "O my Lord, surely I have wronged my own soul, so I submit with Solomon." That is the submission of Solomon to God, Lord of the worlds. She was yielding to God, the Lord of the worlds, and not to Solomon himself, who is of the worlds. She was not restricted in her yielding, no more than are the apostles in their belief in God, unlike Pharaoh, who said, "the Lord of Moses and Aaron." Although Pharaoh shares to some extent in this yielding of Belgis, his power was weak and she had a greater understanding than he in her yielding to God. This is because Pharaoh was subject to the pressure of the moment in saying, "I believe in what the children of Israel believe in," so specifying his belief. He did so only because he heard the magicians say concerning their faith in God, "the Lord of Moses and Aaron." The submission of Belgis was the same as that of Solomon, seeing that she said with Solomon, following him in all the teachings he believed in. In the same way, we are on the same straight path our Lord is on, our forelocks being in his grasp. Nor is it possible that we should be separated from him. We are with him by implication, and he is with us by declaration, since he has said he is with you wherever you are. We are with him by the fact that he has us by the forelock, and he is with himself wherever he may take us on his path, everything in the cosmos being on a straight path, which is the path of the Lord. Thus, Sheba learned from Solomon and said to God, "the Lord of the worlds," without specifying any particular world. As for the power of subjugation by which Solomon was favored and made superior to others, and the dominion God granted to him and to none other after him, its significance lies in the fact that it proceeded from him. As he says, "We subjected to him the wind so that it blew at his command." The matter of subjection alone is not the point, since God has said, "and he has subjected to you all that is in the heaven and in the earth." And he mentioned the subjection of wind, stones, and other things. The point is that these things occur not by our command, but by God's. What singles Solomon out from the rest of us is, if you will only understand, is that he could effect such things by personal command alone, without the need for spiritual concentration or himmah, or the exertion of spiritual power. We say this because we know that cosmic bodies are susceptible to the powers of souls raised to the station of spiritual synthesis, having observed such things along the way. Solomon, however, had only to utter the command to whatever he wished to subject without the need for special states. In other words, Solomon didn't need to perform any magical operations or go into any kind of states of high ecstasy or whatever to effect any causal changes of a magical nature. No, may God assist both of you and us with his spirit, that such a favor conferred on a servant does not affect any dominion he might enjoy in the hereafter, nor is it counted against him, although Solomon asked for it from his Lord. Experience of the way requires that Solomon should be given in advance what is held in store for others, who would be taken to task if they presume to wish for it in the hereafter. God said to him, "This is our favor," without saying upon you or any other, going on to say, "So give or withhold without reckoning." From spiritual experience on the way, we learned that his request for that was made at the command of his Lord. Now, when a request is made by divine command, the one who requests it is fully rewarded for his request. The Creator fulfills the need implicit in what is requested, if he so wills, or withholds it, since the servant has performed what God obliged him to do in obeying his command regarding that which he requested from his Lord. Had he made the request on his own initiative rather than his Lord's command, he would have called him to account for it. This is the case in everything requested of God. As he said to our Prophet Muhammad, "Say, O my Lord, increase me in knowledge." قُلْ رَبِّ زَدْنِي عِلْمًا. And just before I finish this, what Ibn Arabi seems to be implying here is that every genuine request that anybody makes is actually a request that is put into them by the divine itself, which kind of really, really makes this whole issue of prayer, invocation, everything quite interesting from this point onwards when you consider it. Accordingly, he obeyed his Lord's command and was ever seeking more knowledge, so that when he was brought milk, he would regard it as a symbol of knowledge. He once dreamed that he had been given a bowl of milk, which he drank, giving what was left to Umar ibn al-Khattab. On being asked how he interpreted it, he said that he saw it as knowledge. Similarly, when he was taken on the night journey, the angel brought him a vessel containing milk and another of wine. He drank the milk, and the angel said to him, "You have attained to the primordial state of innate spirituality. May God bless your community by you." Thus, whenever milk appears in a vision, it is an image of knowledge, just as Gabriel presented himself to Mary in the guise of a well-made man. When Muhammad said, "All men are asleep, and when they die, they will awake," he meant that everything a man sees in this life is of the same kind as that which one sleeping sees. In other words, an apparition that requires interpretation. And then the poem, "All becoming is an imagination, and in truth also a reality. Who truly comprehends this has attained the mysteries of the way." Thus, when milk was offered him, he said, "God bless us by it and give us increase of it," because he saw it as an image of knowledge, increase in which he had been commanded to seek. When something other than milk was offered, he would say, "O God, bless us by it and feed us with what is better than it." God therefore does not call anyone to account in the hereafter for what he has bestowed in answer to a commanded request. When, however, God bestows something in answer to a request not commanded by him, it is then for God to call the servant to account, or not, as he wishes. I particularly hope, and especially concerning knowledge, that he will not call to account, since his command to his prophet to seek an increase in knowledge applies equally to his community. God has said, "You have in the apostle of God an excellent exemplar." And what finer example is there for one who yearns of God than this following by Muhammad of God's command? Had we expounded the station of Solomon completely, you would have encountered something awesome. For most of the learned of this order are ignorant of the station of Solomon, nor is the matter as they claim it to be. And thus was the chapter of Solomon. Now the floor is open to all of you. Questions, queries, insights, revelations, rants, whatever you want to talk about. Who wants to go first? Anybody?
Is it just me, or is this chapter particularly opaque?
Actually, believe it or not, this is one of the chapters I find the least opaque.
Oh, okay. Maybe I'm fooling
I mean,
myself, but
Jesus I find somewhat opaque, and some of the other chapters before them I find quite opaque.
okay.
Even Adam, the first chapter, can get very opaque sometimes. But this is not that opaque. I mean, he does, as is Ibn Arabi's want, he does, jump around and dance quite a fair bit from one subject to another. But his intention here is fairly consistent, a little bit more than some of the other chapters I find.
Okay, because I actually wanted you to try and like simplify more what it's about.
Luck with Ibn Arabi.
No, just this chapter, because I mean, I find Solomon quite like intriguing, but also dark. I find it, I feel like, and it's probably my own biases, or maybe I don't know what I'm tuning into, but it's just the whole sort of like the command of the jinn, and I guess maybe what people have done with that, subsequently, and tried to, maybe mimic that manipulation or feel justified in that manipulation. Maybe that's what I pick up on, that's dark.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Well, that's a good point for a very simple reason, because toward the end of that chapter, he actually puts his finger on exactly what kind of power Solomon had. So Solomon's power was not a power of conjuration, because he wasn't performing any magical operation. God basically gave him the power to, basically subjugate these jinn. And that was it. So it was not where he was sitting, creating, pentagrams and magic squares and sitting around for hours and going to altered states and what have you, and trying to get these beings to, appear to him and do as he's commanding them. Which means that this is an innate power. And if you kind of take back a few of the layers to the narrative and try to look at the intent of Ibn Arabi himself in this particular archetype, or the Solomonic archetype, and because he's juxtaposing Muhammad and Solomon, he gives us that hadith about the demon or the jinn that had come to attack the prophet, and the prophet basically immediately subjugated and put him on the walls of Medina for the people to mock afterwards. Whereas with Solomon, this issue was already a resolved thing, because they were completely subjugated and submitted to him, and were actually responsible for building his empire. Right? Which means that this came as a divine fiat. And so he didn't have to, strive to subjugate these beings. These beings were already subjugated to him. So this is, I had a discussion with this gentleman, this Nigerian Muslim gentleman years ago, about over a decade ago, on one of my very first theurgy lists. This was back when there was Yahoo groups. And we had a back and forth. I think it was on the list about this very point in the Fusus, that he had been kind of wrestling with for years, didn't understand. Then, if Solomon has that occult power innately, then why is it that we have attributed all of this culture in the Islamic world, and even to some degree in the Jewish one, to Solomon, when Solomon's power is basically a species of his prophetic office?
Yes.
So that this power just basically came with it. And even what Ibn Arabi is explaining in this chapter is that this power came with Solomon by virtue of him having been a gift to David. And so he's also not implying, he's actually saying this, that Solomon's power of judgment was much more keener than David's, because it was ultimately the divine judgment itself that was flowing Sariyan, or circulating through Solomon as its vehicle.
And do you feel like the modern occult hijacked the meaning of that? Like,
Oh, 100%. I mean,
yeah,
but that's I mean, that's a completely different conversation. But I would also even say, not just the modern, I would say even to a great extent, even the culture in the Islamic world, I mean, with al-Buni. And Buni is constantly attributing this, that, and the other thing to Solomon in the Shams
yeah,
al-Ma'arif. And also to Moses. There's things in there that are attributed to Moses and whatnot. What Ibn Arabi is saying is that Solomon didn't have to, Solomon, by virtue of the power that was bestowed with the very office that he occupied, did not require this kind of knowledge. It just happened. If anyone had that kind of knowledge, it was Asif ben Berechiah, who was Solomon's deputy and was a known occultist and whatnot. And then Gaysari and some of the other commentators spent quite a few pages explaining why that is. And they're saying that this kind of power, because, from the perspective of Ibn Arabi's metaphysics, the display of this kind of occult power is actually a display of the lower station and rank of a given conjurer, because a true insan kamil is in a state of perfect servitude. And their focus is on God. Their focus is not on phenomena. Their focus is on noumena all the time. They're the servant. So if anything happens, if there are any miracles or any magical actions that are performed, these are as a consequence of their ubudiyah, of their servanthood and iftiqar, dependency. Whereas an occultist is not there, right? And so their focus is merely in manifesting an element of the power of God on the occult level.
and trying to use the technology of
thinking
the technology is the same as the prophetic power.
Well, but then here's the conundrum that any occultist ever encounters, especially if you read between many different occult traditions, is that there are multiple technologies of the cult, and which one is right? Right? Whereas what Ibn Arabi is saying in this particular chapter is that this is irrelevant.
because of the state of servitude to God.
Because of that state of servitude, of annihilation and subsistence in God, this person doesn't even have to strive for it.
Which is what you're saying is very simple meaning of the chapter. Yeah, because I've come with the preconceptions around what I've seen the occult, people trying to do with the technology to empower themselves as such. I mentioned I was actually missing the obvious, I guess, because that just sounds like it's just any other prophet or enlightened person would have that level of power, and it's not about personal gain.
No.
Oh, thank you.
Sure. Anybody else? Hassan, Hussein, Zachariah, go for it.
So this isn't really a formal question. I guess maybe an explanation in terms of, like, because we did address this before in the previous chapter about his differences with the Ash'ari, like, occasionalism in terms of, like, the inbreathing and outbreathing. I believe it was the chapter of Shu'aib, and then now it's this. So I'm trying to wonder, essentially what he's saying in the whole thing with the quivering of the sphere. This is supposed to be a conceptual, like the thumma is supposed to be to conceptually differentiate objects, and is not a sort of temporal organization.
This is a very, very
Yeah.
difficult argument that Ibn Arabi is putting in the Fusus, and it doesn't get any better in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah either. And I have just read and pored over this and analyzed his method in every context that he's put it. And it's, I don't know whether it is the limits of the language or whether it is the sources or whether it is just the method of reasoning. But to break it down, basically Ibn Arabi is saying that creation at each moment on one very significant element of it is not consecutive, right? That the transformation actually occurs at the very moment of its former state, right? That it is so instantaneous. So we could maybe from a temporal point of view put a before and an after, but on the level of ontological actuality, this recreation is so fast that, you know, to even call it a before and after is wrong. So what he's quibbling is with that, you know, then to use whether as a preposition or a conjunction or whatever, then is misleading. And so it is this transformation is happening at even a faster pace than a twinkling of an eye, and it's not even in terms of a speed of it's located in temporality, but on an ontological level. So my question has always been to Ibn Arabi, well, if this is the case, right, can we not then phrase this entire argument of creation at each moment in a little bit more of a precise kind of way, and say on one level that, okay, even though it's not a temporal recreation in the way that you're objecting to, so then why cannot we rephrase it as a temporal, you know, or a constant recreation that is then flowing into temporality, so that the recreation may be happening on one, you know, level of the vertical that then kind of imprints itself almost instantaneously on the level of, you know, on our level, such that then we can say that it is not the same thing. Because when you conceive of a concept of perpetual recreation, the mind inevitably looks at it from a sequential point of view, and a sequence happens on a horizontal level. Whereas with what Ibn Arabi is saying here, and also what he says also later in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, is that this process should not be taken in a temporal way. So therefore, our conjunctions and prepositions and language are inaccurate and misleading when we try to contextualize this perpetual creation from that point of view. It is a difficult argument that he's putting, and he's not then really, with any kind of analytical rigor, trying to explain what he means by that. So then one then has to draw inferences from what he's saying, which is what I've done. And others have done as well. Like Sa'id Farqani does it in one of his treatises when he's explaining perpetual creation. I think Qunawi also does so in his Nafahat al-Uns. He explains it kind of in the similar way. And then by the time we get into the later, like, you know, with Mullah Sadra, then this is kind of, this whole idea of perpetual creation becomes far more rigorous in the explanations that are offered about it. But even with all of that, what Ibn Arabi is really trying to emphasize is that you have to look at this this entire recreation at each moment from an atemporal position. Because if you look at it from a temporal position, then you get into the fallacy of sequence. And what he's trying to say in this particular passage is that we can't do that.
Yeah, it seems like to me, maybe this is like something that would be in accordance with a lot of like later philosophical developments that they talk about the categories of the mind, which is one of that orients itself, one of them being time and space, and that sort of Kantian sort of thing that starts from there. And he's kind of, I guess, delimiting the boundary, because right here you can't, he's discussing something where language breaks down, because he's talking, you know, the way Arabic is a human language, and it, you know,
Yeah.
created by a human mind, and then, you know, it deals in temporal sequences, and then now it's like kind of breaking outside of that, and that's really like getting and sort of explaining that's incredibly difficult, especially
Well,
at this.
in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah, he spends a lot of pages discussing the concept of the on being the moment, Aleph Nun, right? And from my understanding of it, whether we're talking from Ibn Arabi's point of view or even from his predecessors in the greater philosophical tradition, the on is a contiguous moment. It's a moment where you don't break down. You don't break the on down into different components. It is the component itself, right? And what Ibn Arabi is suggesting is that this recreation occurs within the on, within that moment. And that is why we cannot attribute any kind of a preposition of thumma, of then, to that moment, because it's already a contiguous thing.
Like a continual renewal? Sorry, I was just trying to clarify. Like a continual renewal.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah, I just wanted to link it back to the previous when he's discussing the superiority of the human being because of the perception of the eye and its ability to basically he's just referring here to the speed of light essentially because of the way the instantaneous capturing of light by the eyes, it goes at a rate that obviously they couldn't measure at this time, but it's essentially the fastest thing that there is. So that's very interesting. This part of the chapter was I would agree that it is opaque. Like I need to like take this and like pour over again commentaries and try and like grasp it because it is kind of very difficult. I would say
it's difficult, but it with Ibn Arabi himself doesn't get any better. I mean, in any of his writings, and I've been, like I said, I've been reading his explanations of this and other issues in his thought, in his own writings for years, and contemplating, and the bottom line is that language fails. And even I would say with his successors, that even they are really pushing boundaries to the utmost in their own thought, and they're not quite being able to convey this, what it is that's actually happening. But what he is insisting on here is not to take this as a normal logical sequence in time.
It's very interesting.
Mm.
Yeah, I guess just to like lead on to another topic and another question, it's what he discusses at the end with the very famous all men are asleep, the very famous hadith, all men are asleep, and then when they die they awake. Essentially, like what would you say, because I've always wondered what the reasoning behind us human beings having sleeps and dreaming is, like what purpose does that serve? Kind of hard like to put that into a greater context because it's like the dreams are essentially nonsensical and like
that is the path itself, my man. That is the whole kit and caboodle right there. I mean, we can spend weeks and years just talking about that very point itself because it's rooted into everything. That is the path.
Yeah. And it appears like basically what the whole purpose, I would say, I guess, in this framework of we dream. Obviously, the dreams are like essentially like maybe there's a premonition there, like that's a separate discussion. But essentially, like for the discursive intellect, it's like unintelligible, and you're gonna forget it, immediately after like a couple of minutes after you wake up. And I guess that's sort of like that's an intimation of what, on a broader scale, the relation of our world here is to the greater picture.
Let me give you one of my own experiences. This occurs to me a lot. I have a dream, and this dream is very profound. The moment I wake up, I forget it, right? But then in some point in time in the future, and it could be a short period of time, or it could be a long distance duration of time, based on something that is occurring, this dream, suddenly I remember it. And that dream that I had fits the immediate context of whatever problem or conundrum that I'm facing at that moment. And that remembering of that dream then oftentimes becomes the solution to the problem and the conundrum right then and there. And there's no logicality to this at all. I mean, this happened to me earlier in the year where a dream that I had as a teenager that I'd completely forgotten about. suddenly came in an instant and became the resolution to something, a form I was filling out over something. So,
Yeah, I mean that's a further. I think it's a further. It's like an actual concrete evidence of the nonlinearity of time, because
exactly.
that your entire life is really already like encompassed in a lower like sort of like a summation, and then it just broadens out and expands. And I guess that links back to what you said earlier, because um what happens after the moment, like the day of your birth mimics like the entirety of your life, and it's like it gets to very layers and layers. I guess that's like the foundation of these sorts of occult sciences. So it's very interesting.
100%, yeah. And so then if you take it back to this whole notion of the creation at each moment, this is, I think, where then we can take such experiences and fit it to what he's trying to explain to us about the non-linearity and non-sequentiality of this perpetual recreation itself.
Yep. Very interesting. Gives you a lot to think about, definitely.
Vanessa.
I was going to say that I think the prophet, peace be upon him, he said that we're asleep and we wake up. Dreaming is I think would be a very different meaning.
Mhm.
For me, as you know, the majority of my psychic information comes in dreams, and I've had many confirmations, countless confirmations of things that I couldn't have known in great detail, often at great distances as well. So distance is irrelevant in that, on that level. And for me, actually, the dreaming is the real world, because my mind, when it's awake during the day, is full of egoic and nonsense and distracted thoughts. It's full of thoughts, and when that's shut down in my sleep, I'm free to sort of receive, really, like an antenna in a way, or just to be receptive to all the other people that I'm, or things that I'm tuned into. So it's almost like as I think there's so much danger in the model of telling people that their dreams are just emotional processing or brain
Yeah, I
farting
agree.
kind of
No,
stuff, because it's every
I,
other
I,
culture understands that dreams are
I
not
agree.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
100.
So there's
I do agree. I mean,
yeah.
what they're what
I mean,
contempt.
it can be emotional processing, absolutely.
Well, it is, but that's only like the surface layer of it.
Yeah,
You
you
know,
have to learn to differentiate them. That
you have
takes
to.
experience. Yeah.
It's not only that. See, this is the problem with much of modern Western science, is that it takes the surface of something and says it is only that, so that the surface becomes the explanation for the totality. And this is the problem with it in almost every
Mm.
single domain of its sciences, not just one.
Mm.
I don't say that your dreams are not the processing of your psychological states, whatever. What I'm saying is that that is only the very surface level of it. There's a lot more underneath that.
Sure.
Lot more underneath that.
Mm.
And I have my own experiences to go by, and also within the literature itself, we have so much to prove that this is the case. So I don't discount that level of it, because that level of it has its truth, but that truth is a very surface one.
Mm.
It's not the
And,
it's not the whole picture.
and that's a question I wanted to ask you, because when I try to say, people don't learn unless through direct experience, right? Same with me. You could tell me something that's completely theoretical, and I might dismiss it until I have a direct psychic experience of it. And the only word that I have to use for that is Gnostic, and I don't want to use that word. So I'm looking for another word. Is there a word in Arabic that you feel more captures what I'm trying to get at there,
Well,
with
I
like
mean,
direct Gnostic experience, but not with the,
the
allusion to Gnosticism?
the Greek active verb itself is noesis, right? That is
Mm-hmm.
the active verb in Greek. So, I mean, and I have used that word in several different contexts in the past in my own writings. So, the word gnosis, unfortunately, has kind of gained a little bit of baggage in recent times. And that's why some people seem to object to it, not just the mainstream, but also a lot of specialists are beginning to object to it. In Arabic, we have the words ilm, knowledge, and we also have the words ma'rifa. Ma'rifa is the intuitive, noetic knowing. Right?
Oh, that's ironic. That's actually my name in the Al-Jarahi order.
Sure. So
Yeah.
that is what when we use the word gnosis as a translation in English, that's what we're trying to convey, or irfan, in its noun.
Irfan, okay.
So an active noun. So those are the words that are used. English obviously has also taken a lot of these concepts and words from Greek. Gnosis is not an English word, it's a Greek word. And another word, which is more of a philosophical word, but this one is loaded for the very sole reason that it's very closely attached to Kant, is the word prehension, or apprehension is another form of it. Corban uses apprehension and prehension quite often.
So what's prehension without the A?
Prehension is a species of the noetic knowing, and it is both a apprehension of something is both.
Oh, like comprehension.
Well, yeah, but apprehension is a very specific species. When you prehend something, you are both intellecting it as well as intuiting it.
Okay. Is the pre relevant there as some sort of foreknowledge or not?
The Mullah Sadra Shirazi, one of his philosophical epitomes is entitled Kitab al-Mashaa'ir. And Corban translated the title of this book as Penetration Metaphysique, which sounds a little bit like metaphysical porn. But the word penetration that he's using means prehension. So it is
accessing.
It is accessing. It is intellecting directly on a thing. So it's
mind access.
It's not just a discursive explanation of something. It is intellecting into it. When you prehend. Kant doesn't quite use that concept in the same way, because Kant obviously doesn't believe that this kind of prehension is possible, even though he uses that concept in his critique of pure reason. But the concept in itself is very helpful, and especially because the word mash'ar, especially in the later Islamic philosophical tradition with Mullah Sadra and his teacher Mir Damad, they use that word mash'ar in that technical sense, where it is both it is both a process of aql, the intellect, as well as the ma'rifa simultaneously. You are prehending. And so when it comes to Henry Corban, in a lot of these text, he uses it in several different concepts. He uses prehension, apprehension, and then also the concept of apperception when he tries to get really, really precise. Where it's apperception is perception. It is the witnessing of a thing, but as apperception entails a lot deeper than even the concept of seeing.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
Yeah, because so much in English feels like it's gone into the binary camps of the sort of rational, materialist enlightenment, intellect, logical, empirical, and then all the sort of silly superstition things. And it's difficult to find words in English when you're discussing it that aren't sort of reductionist, I suppose. Thanks.
Sidi, I have here series of questions. You can stop me at any point you decide.
No worries.
The first one, the obvious question that here from the title directly, the meaning of Ar-Rahman and Rahim and the difference between them.
He posits the concept of Rahmat al-Imtinan, which is the general mercy that emerges from that, and that is the nafas al-Rahmaniyya, which he attributes to ar-Rahman in the formula Bismillah Rahman al-Rahim. And then the second form is Rahmat al-Wujub, which is the mercy of necessity, as it were, right? Which is a more circumscribed form of the mercy, and this is connected to ar-Rahim in Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. So the first is the universal. So this is the absolute explosion of the breath of the merciful in every fabric of creation. It is the creative process itself. The second form is the specificity. So the Rahmat al-Wujub, basically attaches to each specific instance of a mercy, right? And the suggestion, although he doesn't quite explicitly say it here, the suggestion is that this is, number one, it is tied to the divine volition, the irada, and also it is something that both God can give and withdraw, because that is it's wajibiyah, as it were.
Because my problem is with the second Rahim, when generally, although it is mostly in the mainstream explanation, but Rahim is basically what you have deserved, and it is given to you by God. But in my limited understanding, this is some sort of Rahim when then compared to Rahman, it is limited or inferior. But
well, it's inferior in because it is the first category is the universal totality. So if we were to take another name and apply it to the Rahmat al-Imtinan, we would basically take the two names al-Muhit and al-Wasi. These two names would be kind of explanatory of the Rahmat al-Imtinan, whereas the Rahmat al-Wujub would be the more specific forms of this, right? That applies individually to each instantiation in their own specific relation to the Rahmat al-Imtinan. Because no specific individuation can obviously be the receptacle for the totality of the mercy, because that totality of the mercy is the totality of existence, right? So in their specifications, in their individuations, each thing in itself is a receptacle for a specific element of that universal mercy, and that is when the Rahmat al-Wujub comes into play.
Okay, so can we I want to escape from the understanding that my limited and shallow understanding of Rahim, that God gives you what you deserve, but in this sense that God is stingy, and if you don't work, God doesn't give to you. But let's say, would it be correct if we say as you have explained, that Rahim, it is specific, but not in the meaning that if you don't work, you don't get anything, but that Rahim is specific in the sense you receive from God what is the best according to your isti'adad and your situation and so on, so that you will further proceed to grow and to going. Okay.
But he also simultaneously says, because the Rahmat al-Wujub is already inside the Rahmat al-Imtinan, because ar-Rahim is within ar-Rahman, that everything receives its particular form of mercy, regardless of what they do or don't do. Okay? But this is the caveat, and this is where I think the Futuhat al-Makkiyah is a very important text to understand the Fusus, is that the works of a given person determine the depth of their istidad. So if you don't work, if you sit around and are lazy and are not doing anything, then the depth of the mercy that you receive, it becomes shallow by virtue of your own inaction. Whereas if you are working, then the depths of your reception becomes that much deeper, and so you receive more of it.
Yes, I understand. I fully agree. Because just let's say in my teenage years, the classical explanation for Rahim is that Rahman, it is universal mercy, which encompasses everything. But Rahim, it means only the mercy in Yawmul Qiyamah, which only the believers are getting. That is what
Well, I
triggered
mean,
me to search for some
yes,
deeper.
yes and no. I mean, Ibn Arabi is saying that everything is receiving that at each moment, and the only difference is between Rahman and Rahim is that that Rahim is specific. So everything has its own form of the Rahim that they receive. That the face of a Rahim is very specific to each instantiation in existence. Each thing has its own version of it. And because nothing repeats. So that's basically what it's saying. Now, whether it comes the day of Qiyamah, everything, if all of existence is contained in the breath of the merciful, then everything by necessity, even if it appears as to be the opposite, is receiving that mercy, even if the mercy appears to them in something that looks unmerciful. That is the that is the mercy.
Okay. So in some sense, Ar-Rahman here, it is analogical to Allah, which is the universal,
Right.
and
Exactly.
Rahim, it is analogical to Rab, which is specific to.
Bang.
Okay.
Yes, that's exactly it. Yes, that's it.
Okay.
Yes, you got it. Yes.
So the next one, it is the ayah when Sulaiman alayhi salam says, وَهَبْ لِي مُلْكًا لَا يَنْبَغِي لِأَحَدٍ مِّن بَعْدِي. So my Lord, give me such kind of dominion of power, yes, which no one after me would have or express or something like that. So my question would be, from the point of view that Muslim point of view, that our Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is the more perfect tajalli of Allah Ta'ala, and also the same for the the Imams. Are we not expecting that in some sense they also would be a tajalli of the power of Allah Ta'ala, which subjugates everything in the manner in which Sulaiman alayhi salam.
I agree, and I think in one sense, Ibn Arabi's bias is coming up here in his interpretation of this, because we know for a fact that this mulk that is being spoken of, that Solomon claims that nobody before him has ever received, was actually received by Muhammad in a much more expansive way. The kingdom of Solomon disappeared after a few generations. Okay? Whereas the mulk Muhammadi has not disappeared 1400 years later. It still exists.
If you can add something more in the sense you have said that it is not so much of what it is displayed, but what you have received in the meaning that the perfect station is the station of the slave, where you just received the will of God, compared to the station.
Whoop.
acting of his own will.
You cut off there for a second. Can you say that again?
The other thing you said previously, I think also added to the question that the perfect station, it is who follows the will of God the whole time.
Yeah.
In difference from the one who is acting of his own will, also he have the power to do it.
Yeah. And this is a point that he kind of raises in a kind of a sort of roundabout sort of way, in his own way, where he is then talking about the knowledge of Muhammad, and that God makes the knowledge of Muhammad an element of the Sunnah of Muhammad to be followed. This is very different from Solomon. And in the story of Sheba and Solomon, Sheba doesn't say, I am following Solomon in my submission to God, right? She's saying, I am submitting to God with Solomon. Whereas what Ibn Arabi is saying here is, for the Muslimun, they are not just submitting to God, they are submitting to God through Muhammad, through Muhammad's knowledge. There's a very sharp, conspicuous difference here between these two forms. And this is where, even though he says one thing, a few paragraphs before the end, but this particular example kind of qualifies what he's saying, in that, so therefore the Mulk Muhammadi is a more complete version of what Solomon had. So it is a true Mulk because it endured as well, right? Whereas Solomon's didn't. Even though Solomon had full occult power of the subjugation of all these subtle beings and entities in the jinn.
Yes, the knowledge lives much longer than the political power. Okay, and the last one, the comparison between Dawood alayhi salam and Sulaiman alayhi salam. That Dawood alayhi salam, he was given knowledge by God, but the Sulaiman alayhi salam, he was the very knowledge of God, in the sense that when Dawood alayhi salam, he got judged using his own intellect, but based on the knowledge of God. And when Sulaiman alayhi salam judged, it was the direct judgment of God without intermediaries, and it was tied to the ijtihad. That, if I understood correctly, when the mujtahid is wrong, he is as if in the situation of Dawood alayhi salam, when he tries his best according to his capabilities. But when the mujtahid is right, that is, let's say, the judgment of God which proceeds through the specific person. Can we make such kind of comparison?
Yeah, this is a good example, because it kind of segues into an intention that he has in this particular chapter that he's not expressing. If we take David and Solomon as the mujtahid and the arif, David is the mujtahid, Solomon is the arif, right? The mujtahid has to think through an issue, break it down, look at its component, and in some sense he's blind because there are maybe factors that he's not seeing, even in his analysis and dissection of a given problem. But the arif is seeing things as they truly are. That is the difference between the mujtahid and the arif. So the judgment of the arif is the judgment of that prayer. Allahumma arina haqa'iq al-ashya kama hiya, whereas the mujtahid is not seeing things as they truly are.
So the station of the arif is what you have discussed with Vanessa, that he's as mash'ar, simultaneously you are understanding it by intellect, but you are also in the same time seeing it directly.
Exactly. You're prehending it. You are you're engaging in an apperception where both the intellection of the matter and the witnessing of the matter are the same thing, right? And this is the deep gnosis, immediate. And it's not just a meditative one, it's an active one. So a problem comes to you, one person looks at it and they're only looking at it at the surface, issue of it. they're not looking deeper into the causalities of the issues and what it is tied to and the implications that the issue may have. And so, whereas one is just basically making a judgment based on the immediate perception of that thing, the other is making a judgment both on the immediate perception of it as well as everything that is within it, that it is connected to at the same time. And so obviously the second is going to make the more correct judgment because he's seeing the full picture in all of its layers, whereas the other is only looking at its outward layers. So this, I have taken it this way before, that in a very subtle way, Ibn Arabi is actually positing a very, very sharp critique between the fuqaha and the urafa, where Solomon is the arif and David is the faqih.
And this led to just another question, because in the one of previous chapters, forgot which of them, ijtihad was on Isa alayhi salam, the previous one, if I'm not wrong. Ijtihad was mentioned again as something positive.
Yes.
But exactly, because as you are saying, he's also very critical about fuqaha, but the positive ijtihad is when you are doing it with the sincere intention to reach the truth, even you are blind to see it directly, but
Yes.
not when you are using ijtihad, the let's say discursive logic, just to argue against the truth and against the
Or,
urafa.
even more limited to that, when ijtihad becomes, or it's not just in Islamic fiqh, you also get this in most modern legal systems where an issue is not assessed on the totality of its merits. An issue is assessed based on on a similar precedent that exists, so that a judgment then becomes basically imposing formulas on a given case, a pattern of formulas, and not in assessing the actual case itself, right? We have this in the Islamic world, whether on the Sunni or the Shia side, and what Ibn Arabi is doing is very subtle critique of this, because the Arif is, a true judge, a true Hakim, it needs to have the ability to see the entire panorama of the thing. Whereas a faqih, for some whatever reasons of its own, doesn't do that. They're either imposing a formula and then judging it by that formula and making their final judgment on the whole thing based on the formula, or their analysis of a given situation is very limited because they're only seeing the surface problem and not the causalities and all the other layers attached to it.
And just last comment, excuse me. So here, that is very similar, at least to me, where in one of his dialogues, Plato, he's saying that the lawgiver, he is higher than the law itself, but he's speaking about the philosopher king exactly because he's not judging by formulas, he's seeing directly the realities.
Bang. Yeah, that's exactly
Okay.
right. And this has been an issue that has been in debate in philosophy, and people who don't like Plato, like, for example, Karl Popper, when they write about Plato's Republic, they never, ever bring this up, what you just said. Although that is the actual intention of what Plato is saying, because the lawgiver is not just basically, coming up with a bunch of very nice sounding formulas and saying, you shall live by these. The lawgiver, the true philosopher king, is seeing a whole trajectory of causality, and then by that they are formulating these axioms needed, to become the laws that a certain people will live by.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Yeah. Mohammed, Ali, you had something to say?
No, those were my questions. Thank you very much, Sidi.
Yep.
I've been puzzling over this whole recurrent creation thing since we started talking about it. I learned about it a while back, but now I'm revisiting it with this specification that it's not a temporal process. But I was just thinking through I just had some thoughts. I was thinking there's like a couple of different ways to go with it. One is, if it's true that it's not, so if recurring creation is true, then there's no empirical continuity between things, or within one thing. I'm taking this right out of Corban. He says this in when he's expositing this. So we perceive things that way, like we perceive stability in things and in ourselves, and even in our minds. But there isn't. But that continuity is at the level of the Ain.
Yes.
It's not at this level, because we're constantly being annihilated and coming back into existence.
Something that Ibn Arabi says that Chittick actually translates in the section of ontology in the Sufi path of knowledge, I think is very helpful to understand this entire problem, is where Ibn Arabi actually says that stability is not a higher state in the Gnostic's vision. Fluctuation is the higher state. And hence, the whole notion of taqallub, right, that Ibn Arabi very much attaches to, and he then connects that to the greater ontology of the recreation of things in each moment. And he states very matter-of-factly that, this whole stability and peace that certain Gnostics search for is an illusion, because the true vision of things is their incessant fluctuation between the two fingers of God, right? This is completely backwards to what most spiritual disciplines are saying, that, you are enlightened and you're, you have attained the presence of the divine presence when you show that peace within yourself. And Ibn Arabi is saying, no, that's not the case. One bit. It is actually being able to stand in that fluctuation of things where, and then, fully apprehending and apperceiving this incessant recreation of things that is the higher state. And interesting enough, Chittick brings this up from that passage in the Futuhat al-Makkiyah where Ibn Arabi is talking about boredom and how the true Gnostic can never be bored, because there's always something happening in creation. And a Gnostic, a true Gnostic that knows their own heart in its fullest sense, understands the nature of this fluctuation in creation, which is not in just like, just stopping and in peace and everything is like sunk into a state of samadhi. It is just constantly changing and recreating and moving and doing this, that, and the other thing.
Could you just repeat, sorry, when you said the two something of God? I didn't hear you properly. Sorry.
There's
just
a
fluctuating
hadith,
between the two something.
There's a hadith Qudsi that Ibn Arabi loves to quote more than as much as he quotes some, that the heart of the believer is in between the fingers of the merciful. Bayna asabiyan al-Rahman, right? So Ibn Arabi uses this hadith as an explanation of fluctuation in creation at each moment. And he derives that fluctuation from the very root of the word for heart itself, heart being qalb. And when you conjugate it, according to the rules of Arabic grammar, you derive the word taqallub, which means transformation, fluctuation, etc. And the heart is in a process of incessant transformation. And he says this, that whoever knows their heart knows the nature of the transformation in existence itself, the incessant change. So for Ibn Arabi, a heart that is at just like in a complete repose is dead. It's not, a heart beats, right? And that, movement of the heart and the sound of the heart in a sense is kind of the mirror analogy to the inhalation and exhalation of God's creation and destruction of things at each moment.
Thank you. Sorry to.
Sure.
So So that takes place at the level of, well, that takes place on both levels, right? We could talk about it at the temporal, empirical level, but also at the level of the Ein.
Yeah.
So, because I was going to say,
at the level of the aim, just remember, at the level of the aim, these are not even fully existent things. These are potential existence, right? It is only at the level of their actualization in the Aini sense of this world that they become concrete particulars. So that argument is, neither here nor there, but at the level, even one could make the argument that even at the level of their conceptualization in the mind of God, there's a fluctuation in process because they're not fully existent, and then they're demanding to be existentiated from that state. So there is no stability. They're not just sitting there and just completely blown out by God. They're demanding to come into existence.
that there is some kind of thubudiya. There is some sense of permanence, and now I'm trying to, because I keep thinking that this sounds like certain kinds of Buddhism where it's like,
Oh yeah, absolutely.
dissolve the identity of something until there's just nothing left. But that's always seemed to me to be counter to like an Islamic or an Advaita Vedanta perspective, where there is, at the end of the day, there is some kind of permanence to a self. But this makes it sound like even at the level of the Ein, there's this kind of fluctuation.
Yeah. So the with every, like I've said from the very first session, with Ibn Arabi, you have to take this non-dual dialectic, which is which is and it isn't simultaneously. So it is both a sabit, it is both a permanent, and it is not simultaneously. It just depends on which perspective that you're kind of looking at the problem at. He, not he. Everything is this. Hu, huwa, la huwa. And it is Zen.
Okay.
It is completely Zen. It drives. I've seen people lose their minds engaging with Ibn Arabi a little bit too much. Jeff, you got a question?
I just wanted to mention a helpful physical analogy with music, the idea of a tone or the reality of a musical tone. I think it's a great analogy because every tone that you hear contains all of the tones, but you only hear one tone. Like there are, there's a multiplicity of perceptible tones, but in any given moment, your brain is only decoding like a particular tone. I don't know how it all works, in terms of the mechanics, but the point is every tone you hear actually contains all of the tones that are possible, but you're only perceiving a specific tone out of the totality of them all. But it doesn't matter what tone that you are looking at or trying to identify. Like the more you examine it, the closer you examine it, the more tones are revealed, so that there are dominant tones, then there are less dominant tones. And it turns out that the entire spectrum of all possible tones is always contained in every specific tone. So I don't know if that helps or not, but like talking about the mercy as like, let's just call that the tone that contains all of the tones, and each specific instantiation of compassion would be like, like an analogical to an instantiation of a specific tone out of the entire range of tones. But they're all identical. Like there's no difference between one tone and another. They all have the same essence.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're just different specifications of tone in general, which, at a certain level, there's no distinction between an A or a B or a C. They're all the same thing. It's just, I don't know how to express it any better than that, but do you know what I mean?
Your point is great. Your point is
okay. All right.
great. Yeah, it's
So
perfect.
I return that analogy constantly. Like there's so much that when I'm reading, if I just relate it to what I know about music theory, now I know everybody doesn't know a lot about music theory, but I think it's good advice for anybody, even if they have no intention of, going down a road of learning music or how to play an instrument, just familiarizing yourself with just basic, some basic principles of music theory goes a
Mhm.
long way in understanding the basic principles of other types of theory and other fields,
I agree.
including this
100%.
one.
Or even, any kind of art, drawing, etc. Art is the
Yeah,
same. Yeah.
exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
there's so many different ways we can demonstrate all of these things in terms of analogies. Yeah, so I just wanted to throw that out there because for me,
Perfect.
it's yeah. So that's it.
100% agree. Yeah.
I think what Jeffrey's saying, it is exactly an excellent example. In this chapter, what Sheikh Muhyiddin is saying, that every part of the universe is already the whole universe, but it is in potentiality.
Yes.
Yes.
And its potentiality on one level, if you think about it, is its actualization, even if that actualization has not occurred in the time we're in right now.
Right.
Get your head around that one.
Okay, and one other thing about just fluctuation too.
Hmm.
Tones decay. They don't last forever. You hear a tone and it immediately starts to decay into nothingness. And also, in order for the tone to persist, it's as everybody knows, it's a vibration, it's a frequency. So it's not just a steady, sound that you're perceiving. What you're actually perceiving is the fluctuation back and forth of a wave. It goes up and down, up and down, up. And so you're perceiving fluctuation. You're not perceiving a solid object. And it's the fluctuation that gives rise to the appearance of a solid object in your ear. But it's not solid. It never was solid. It's kind of an illusion, but it sounds solid. And like I'm saying solid, but I mean, um, you know, uh, oh God, the word just escaped me. But anyway, you get my point. I wanted to just
Yeah,
riff on what you were talking
absolutely. I
about,
get
the
your point.
fluctuation. The fluctuation is everything. Everything
Yeah,
arises from the fluctuation, even
everything. And this is
and that can be
precisely what,
demonstrated with music.
and this is what Ibn Arabi is saying, that the fluctuation, this taghallub, is as the basis of everything in creation. Everything is in a state of perpetual fluctuation. And the human heart, and especially the heart of the true Gnostic, is the most, experience this fluctuation more than anything from state to state. And then he uses this as the way to try to explain this perpetual creation at each moment. I mean, with Ibn Arabi, just the Sufi tradition as a whole, and I think this is where some of the mistaken perceptions about Sufism in the West may have crept in. From the proof text of Sufism itself, whether it's the Quran, but especially some of these hadith Qudsi, like the hadith of the hidden treasure, etc. One of the characteristics that one gleans about the nature of God is that God is desirous for something. It desires to be known. This is not a God that is completely disengaged and is in a state of, complete sat. It is desiring to be at each moment. And then even Arabi, when he's explaining, this dynamic of the breath of the merciful, uses words like qurb in Arabic, or kurba, this struggle, like a mother, who's, in labor, breathing heavily, trying to push the baby out of her womb. These are the kind of words that Ibn Arabi is employing in the description of this process. So this is not a divinity in repose in any shape or form. And as above, so below, is what also Ibn Arabi is saying. which is in fact, you know, for me is the most intuitive position at all. And so all these, you know, positions that we have, especially in the contemporary times, and particularly with a lot of these New Agers, where, you know, if you're spiritual, you have to appear in a certain peaceful kind of way, otherwise you're non-spiritual, in their opinion. It's complete bollocks from the position of this wisdom tradition.
So the angry Old Testament God, it is a real representation of the one of aspects
From a
of
very
the reality.
from a circumscribed point of view, absolutely, yes, it is, because that God is actually a reflection of those prophets anyway. It's them that this Yahweh is reflecting, you know. So yeah. That's a good point.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
If I may add to what Jeff was saying there, I think it was last week I started to try and conceptualize the unity of being, seeing the Mandelbrot set, the fractal.
Yeah.
That if you zoom in on one component, it looks, you know, like a whole bunch of things.
Yeah.
But if you zoom out, it's the same thing repeating itself. So the person that says
Yes.
it is one is correct, and the person that says it's many, like it's Trinity or it's this or that, you know, is also correct. So you can just keep going. You can keep zooming in on all these separate components.
This is something that you know, I am constantly having to remind Muslims of. The word tawheed does not mean oneness. The word tawheed means to make one. If you want to be literal in the Arabic, it does. That's what the word tawheed means, right? To make one, rather than oneness. Right? That would be something. Oneness would be wahidiyya or ahadiyya, but tawheed is literally means to make one. So,
to make one, meaning it's a conscious willing act in that making? Is it
well,
like an imperative making, or
that is a whole nother conversation that could lead us into all kinds of rabbit holes of discussion, which is the entire philosophical tradition of Islam, as a matter of fact. But that is what the meaning of tawheed literally means, to make one, rather than oneness. So that is why, you know, some of us have coined this neologism. When we talk about tawheed, we use the word unicity rather than unity. Yeah.
I know we're over time, but I did have one question, if you will indulge me, but if not,
Sure.
I will can it.
Ask, go ahead.
So I what you've been talking about, the, you know, the intellectual versus the prehensive knowledge. And it makes me think about, you know, the Sharia versus people, you know, when people get stuck in dogma versus adaptation.
Yeah.
And it brought to mind this Osho story. I know Osho is controversial, but I read in one of his books that it's these Buddhist monks, and an assassin approaches them and says, "Which way did you see a guy? Which way did he go?" And they did see a guy, so they think, well, if we tell the truth, you know, he could kill the guy, but then if we lie, we're not supposed to lie. But then what if we don't help him kill the guy, and that guy that he's going to kill is a bad guy who's going to kill other people? And it goes on and on. So basically his point is that you never step in the same river twice. All you have is your intuition in the present. So trying to apply static, you know, morality, right, or absolute morality is, there's just too many variables in the present.
Yes.
So, and do you feel that can be applied to what you were talking about?
Of course. Well, if it wasn't the case, if this wasn't the case, then there wouldn't be systems of jurisprudence and law. If there were moral, if, you know, I mean, this is the most intuitive position. I think, you know, the other position that argues about moral absolutes is the more counterintuitive position. If moral absolutes existed, right, then there wouldn't be a need for any kind of judicial system. There wouldn't be a need for Sharia. There wouldn't be a need for fiqh.
To consider all those variables.
Yeah, because
right.
By the reason that these, you know, these things are not absolute and they're constantly in a state of flux and need to be judged on their own merits, is because that is the reason why we have systems of law in place, why we put railings in place. Not because the if moral absolutes existed, arguably they wouldn't need to be railings.
Very true.
I mean, this has been obvious to me for a long time. And in one sense, I think systems that legislate laws based on the contingency of the times are actually much closer to the principle of things than those who are adamantly insisting on a absolute morality. That there's an absolute good and bad that they can actually then delineate. Because if humankind, and now this is Hegel talking, but if we posit that the spirit of humanity, rather than the Godhead, but the spirit of humanity is evolving in its experience of matter. Therefore, how a humanity perceives one set of mores at one point in time versus how it perceives it at another point in time are different. So, by that very reality, there cannot be a moral absolute. There are certain basic moral there are certain axiomatic truths, but even those axiomatic truths are fluid in the way that they manifest from one point to another. If this weren't the case, then we wouldn't have the prophets being sent to humanity. If this weren't the case, we wouldn't have multiple civilizations that each approach these various questions in different ways.
Yeah, we need organizing principles.
And funnily enough, these atheists and secular humanists usually blame religionists for subscribing to the moral absolute, whereas if you approach these questions from the point of view of a religious mystic, actually that absolute goes away. And you have a far more powerful argument now, even against these secular humanists who are trying to relativize everything. We're saying that the relativity is already embedded into things. You need to understand the nature of the movement of spirit, and then the movement of the human spirit within that greater spirit to understand this process, rather than say that we're asserting moral absolutes. Actually, we're not asserting moral absolutes if you pay close attention.
Do you think that's where that perception in some of the Western Sufism, because it can be hijacked, to reject any organizing principles and say, well, I just flow with the moment and do whatever I feel like doing, which is a sort of way of rejecting the Sharia as some sort of control or oppressive force. And that's the way they're conceptualizing it.
That depends on the situation. I mean, the whole anything goes perspective suffers from, well, first of all, it itself is absolutizing that freedom, and not realizing that in occurring in a spatio-temporal format in this world, that certain railings are necessary for its own safety in that freedom, without which it can fall off a cliff, and usually will.
And for mercy.
Yeah. But no, I'm talking about the one who says anything goes. Well, if
no, but I'm saying without those principles, how do we use the principle of mercy? Like, because then it's just I do whatever I want.
Well, if you do anything you want, the mercy would be in someone telling you, well, no, you can't, because if you walk down the street without stopping at the stoplight, you're going to get hit by a car.
Yeah.
Right. Yes. And on a spiritual path, this is why some kind of an ethical formula or some kind of an ethical approach to the basic questions of human interaction are necessary. So there is no anything goes. If anything goes, then I mean, I know that for example in Byronshire, a lot of these sannyasins talk this way, but I would like to see them if, for example, one sannyasin decided to, without the permission of another sannyasin, jump into the sack with his wife. How would he take that? He wouldn't like it.
Well, Osho himself was a great example of what happens with anything goes.
Yeah, see, so not everything goes. There are boundaries, there are railings, and these railings are there for a reason. We are in a experiential realm of duality, and there are certain rules, but these rules are fluid. I mean, what the Quran offers is so general that it is possible to apply what the Quran is saying based on any contingency in time, based on that time. which is what essentially what Ali alayhi salam says right at the beginning of the Nahj al-Balagha, raise your children according to the standards of the time, and he's telling them, don't ossify in your understanding of what these laws are.
Mm. Mm. Yeah, I think it's like out of 57 Muslim countries, no two of them have the same Sharia because it's so open to interpretation.
Boom, exactly right. That's exactly right. Yeah, but that doesn't mean. I mean, from my point of view, that kind of originary spirit at the moment, at least, amongst the vast majority of Muslims, is not there. Instead, there's a lot of disunity and disharmony and harping and griping and polemics and BS. But in theory, none of this is an impediment, and Muslims can be actually even more progressive than what the West claims, in theory. Because there is a fluidity that is embedded in at least the originary notion of what a Sharia is.
So it's kind of an ignorance of the fact that Sharia is applied with consideration of the variables in the same way as Western law, whereas in the West it's maybe being perceived as some sort of a
but by the same time,
clay tablet kind of thing.
I have argued this every which way in a Sunday with some of these Maturidis and Asharis online for years, where they, and I said, look, if what I'm saying is wrong, then you need to explain that why from the very moment that we got the Quran, there has been such a body of expansion in legal opinion. Why do you people invoke Ibn Hanbal or Ibn Malik or the Shafi, Imam al-Shafi, etc., if what I'm saying is untrue? So, Islam itself actually developed a system of precedent, of legal precedent, which is now the basis of the Western jurisprudential system. So there's an acknowledgement, even by these, conservatives and reactionaries, that there is a fluidity in the implementation of what we understand to be the Sharia, that there is no immutability in our understanding of how this should be implemented.
Thank you.
Sure.
Can I just ask a quick follow-up on the thing that I was mentioning before? Just as like more of a practical question, because we think of we talk about the fitra, and there's a concept of authenticity connected to that, like being oneself and attaining to one's fitra, and we've mentioned it before in the class. So I'm just wondering, like, if there's any like practical implications of thinking of the ayn or the fitra as being not completely stable, actually being something that's is partly non-existent at some, or depending on how you look at it.
A profoundly interesting point. And it is something I have thought about, because then the implication based on what Ibn Arabi is saying about the taghallub is that there's an instability in the fitra, and the fitra itself is developing. And the way I think about this issue is that even though we are in a sense going back to the fitra in the past, yet we have not really ever left the fitra, either our fitra, during the course of the path or during the course of our lives. And that fitra is just another way of saying our Lord. And so then the process of the path then becomes more and more becoming aware of this dynamic in itself, and how this fitra qua Lord is the one that is traveling with us on that path. And so once we get to that place that we then realize this completely, really prehend it, is that is the aha, awakening, fana baqa kind of moment for each person, such that then this fitra itself is participating with us, which is us, in every element of that process of the taghallub that is happening from the moment of our birth.
Okay, I'll think about that. Thanks.
Sure. Folks, we're almost at 2 hours, but this was a good session. Unless anybody has a really important question they want to ask about this that we haven't covered thus far, I think we'll leave it here for this week. So let's start on the chapter of David for next week, and the zikr and attached to that is the zikr of Ya Wujudu, O existence or O being. So let's leave that here for this session, and then we'll all come back together same time next week. Everybody have a great week. Yeah.